For years she had been living in the shadows of his power, too afraid to speak out, too afraid to break free. To everyone around them, their life seemed perfect. He was charming, successful, and had the ability to win over anyone he met. People admired him. They thought he was the man to be around, the one with the answers, the one in control. But in the privacy of their home, behind the closed doors, it was a different story. She was a quiet person by nature, someone who didn't like to draw attention to herself. She found comfort in the quiet moments, away from the bustling crowds and the eyes of others. But even in her silence, she had always felt a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. It wasn't just a feeling. It was a constant presence in her life. He had made sure she knew who was in control. His words were sharp, cutting through her confidence like a knife. When he spoke to her, it was as if her feelings didn't matter, as if her needs and dreams didn't even exist. She had tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself that things would get better, that maybe it was just a phase, but it never was. No one knew the truth about their relationship. She had kept it all hidden, burying her pain deep inside. To the outside world, they were the perfect couple. They had the house, the car, the social life. People envied them, admired them. She had learned to put on a mask, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, a laugh that was more forced than genuine. She told herself it was fine. She told herself she was lucky. But deep down, she knew it wasn't true. He had a way of making her feel small. He didn't have to raise his voice or even use force to get what he wanted. His words were enough. He knew exactly how to twist her thoughts, how to make her doubt herself, and she did. She doubted everything. Her self-worth. Her worth as a person. She couldn't escape the grip of his control no matter how hard she tried. It wasn't always like this. When they first met, he had been charming and kind. He made her feel special, like she mattered. She had fallen in love with his confidence, his easy smile, the way he made everything seem so effortless. At first, he was everything she had ever wanted. But over time, that charm turned into something else, something darker. The smiles became rare and the laughter quieter. Instead of feeling loved, she started to feel like she was walking on eggshells, waiting for the next verbal attack, the next criticism that would leave her heart aching. She began to believe she was worthless. He made sure of that. Every mistake, every slip-up was her fault. She had learned to apologize for things that weren't even her doing. His control over her grew stronger with each passing day. It was as if he had turned into a puppet master, pulling at the strings of her life, making her dance to his tune without even realizing it. People would see them together and wonder how they could be so happy. The truth was, she was living in fear. Fear of his anger, fear of his disappointment, fear of what would happen if she ever said no, or if she ever questioned him. The thought of standing up to him was terrifying. She couldn't even imagine it. What if he left her? What if he told everyone the things she had kept secret? She wasn't sure she could handle the truth getting out. Despite the years of torment, she tried to keep going. She tried to pretend that everything was fine. But inside she was breaking. She didn't know how much longer she could keep up the facade. Each day felt like a struggle, like she was just getting through the motions, not truly living. She had lost herself along the way. One day, everything changed. It started with a conversation that had been building up for weeks. They had been having dinner at their usual spot, a quiet little restaurant they often went to when they needed to get away from the world. It was supposed to be a simple meal, a quiet night, but he had been acting strangely, more distant than usual. She noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept darting around the room as if he were looking for something. When she asked him what was wrong, he snapped. The words he spoke were cutting, cruel. He accused her of being weak, of not understanding him. He belittled her, made her feel small as he often did. But something inside her snapped. For the first time, she felt a surge of anger rising in her chest. It was as if a switch had flipped inside her, and for the first time in years, she didn't want to take it anymore. She had had enough. She sat there, staring at him, trying to find the right words to say. He had caught her off guard, as always, but she could feel something inside her pushing her forward. This time, she wasn't going to let him get away with it. This time, she would fight back. "I'm not the one with the problem," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. "You've been tearing me down for years, and I'm done letting you do it." He laughed, thinking she was joking. He always did. But this time, he didn't know her like he thought he did. She wasn't the same person anymore. She had started to see through his lies, to understand that she wasn't the one at fault. The words came out of her mouth before she could stop them. "You've controlled me for too long. You've made me think I was nothing, but I'm not afraid anymore." For a moment he looked at her, stunned. Then, as if remembering who he was, he tried to dismiss her words. He tried to laugh it off, but there was a nervousness in his eyes now. For the first time, she saw a crack in his confidence. He wasn't in control anymore. The power had shifted, even if just a little. She left that night feeling different. It wasn't a victory, but it was a step toward something bigger. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let him continue to have the upper hand. For the first time in years, she felt like she had a choice, and it was a powerful feeling. The next few days were difficult. He tried to regain control, of course. He sent her flowers, texted her apologies, but she wasn't fooled. She had seen the real him, and she wasn't going to let him back into her life. She wasn't going to let him manipulate her anymore. But even with the small sense of power she had gained, she knew the battle wasn't over. There was still more to come. The courtroom, she knew, would be where everything would change. There she would finally have her voice. There she would stand up for herself in a way she never had before. And it would be a moment that neither of them would ever forget. For now, though, she was preparing herself. Preparing for the fight that was ahead. It wouldn't be easy, but she was ready. She had already taken the first step. The rest of the journey would come one step at a time. The days following that night felt like a strange mix of relief and fear. For the first time in years, she had spoken up. The words had come out of her mouth like a breath of fresh air, and for a moment she felt free. But as the reality of the situation set in, the weight of what she had done started to settle heavily on her chest. She had broken the silence. She had shown him that she was no longer his victim. But the battle was far from over. Every time she looked at her phone, she would see the messages from him. The flowers. The apologies. He was trying to reel her back in, to make her believe that everything could go back to how it was. But she knew better now. She had seen the truth of who he was, and she wasn't about to let him rewrite history, but it wasn't easy. She still loved him. Despite everything, there were moments when she remembered the good times, the early days when he had made her feel like the most important person in the world. She had convinced herself that those moments were real, that he wasn't always like this. Maybe it was just a phase. Maybe things could be better again. But deep down, she knew it wasn't a phase. This was who he was. And if she let him back in, she would only be making the same mistakes again. She had to stay strong. She had to remember everything he had done to her. The hardest part wasn't the lies he had told her or the way he had made her feel small. It was the fact that she had allowed it to happen. She had let him control her for so long that she couldn't remember who she was without him. She had lost herself in the relationship, and now she was trying to find her way back. The more she thought about it, the more she realized just how much of her life had been shaped by his control. Every decision she had made, every choice she had thought was her own, had been influenced by him. Even her friends had been carefully chosen to fit into his vision of what was best for her. The people who cared about her had never been able to see the full picture, never been able to see the subtle ways he had manipulated her, because she had kept everything hidden. She had kept up the act, pretending to be happy, pretending to be in control. But now, with the truth out in the open, she felt exposed. She knew she couldn't go back to pretending anymore. She had to do something. She had to take control of her life. And the first step was making sure he couldn't reach her. It wasn't easy. Every time she tried to take a step forward, she felt like she was being pulled back into the past. His calls, his messages, the constant reminders of the life they had shared. It was hard to move on when everything around her was still tied to him. Even the house they lived in, the one she had once dreamed of, now felt like a prison. Every corner, every room held memories of him. The place that once felt like home now felt suffocating. She couldn't stay there any longer. She needed a fresh start, a new beginning away from everything that reminded her of him. So, she packed up her things, carefully folding her clothes and placing them into boxes. She moved quietly, not telling anyone what she was doing. She didn't need their pity, didn't want their concern. She just needed space to breathe. It wasn't until she was sitting in the empty apartment, surrounded by boxes and the quiet hum of a new place, that she allowed herself to truly feel. For the first time in years, she felt the weight lifting off her shoulders. It wasn't gone entirely, but it was lighter now. She could see a future for herself, a future where she wasn't constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for him to strike. The next few days were filled with uncertainty. She didn't know where to go from here. She had no idea what her future held, but one thing was certain. She couldn't do it alone. She had to reach out for help. She had to find the courage to ask for support. She called a close friend she hadn't spoken to in months. Her friend had always been there for her, even when she had pushed her away. The years of isolation, of pretending everything was fine, had made her forget what true friendship felt like. But now she needed it more than ever. When they met, her friend didn't ask questions. She didn't push. She just listened. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself be vulnerable. She let herself cry, to finally release the pain she had held inside for so long. Her friend didn't judge her. She just held her, offering quiet comfort, letting her know that she was there for her, that she wasn't alone. With her friend's support, she began to think about her next steps. She had always been afraid of what might happen if she stood up to him. What if he retaliated? What if he tried to destroy her reputation? She had seen how powerful he could be, how he could manipulate anyone into believing whatever story he told. She had never considered that she might have the strength to fight back. But now, with the truth weighing on her heart, she knew it was time. Her friend helped her find a lawyer, someone who could help her navigate the legal process. It was a terrifying decision. The thought of going up against him, of facing him in court, filled her with anxiety. But she also knew that if she didn't take this step, she would be allowing him to win. She would be allowing him to keep controlling her life, to keep manipulating her. The process wasn't easy. The lawyer had to gather evidence, talk to witnesses, and build a case that would expose his lies. Every step of the way she was terrified. What if they didn't believe her? What if she couldn't prove anything? What if he somehow got away with it? But as the days passed, she realized something important. She wasn't doing this for him. She was doing it for herself. She was taking back control of her life one step at a time, and no matter how difficult it was, she knew it would be worth it. The trial seemed like a distant reality, something that wasn't even real until the moment she stepped into the courtroom. The thought of standing in front of everyone facing him was enough to make her stomach turn. But she knew she had no choice. She had to do this. She had to fight for herself, for the woman she had almost lost. It wasn't easy, but every day she grew stronger. She knew the journey ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was moving in the right direction. She had found the courage to stand up for herself. She had taken the first step toward freedom. And no matter what happened next, she knew one thing: she was ready. The day of the trial arrived faster than she had expected. The weight of it all pressed down on her chest as she walked into the courtroom, her heart beating loudly in her ears. The room was filled with people, lawyers, witnesses, and the cold, unblinking gaze of the judge. It felt like the entire world was watching her, waiting for her to make her move. But no one was more important to her than the man sitting across the room, the man who had caused her so much pain, the man who thought he could control everything, including her. She had prepared for this moment in the quiet of her new apartment, surrounded by supportive friends and her legal team. She had gone over her testimony, practiced what she would say, and tried to steady the nervous tremor in her hands. But no matter how much she practiced, nothing could fully prepare her for the experience of actually being in that room, facing him in front of everyone. The tension in the courtroom was thick, almost tangible. People whispered among themselves, casting quick glances at her as she entered. She could feel their eyes on her, judging, analyzing. But she kept her focus. She couldn't afford to let her nerves take over now. This was it. This was her chance to speak the truth, to make sure he could never hurt her again. Her lawyer, a calm and patient woman who had been guiding her through every step of this process, sat next to her. She whispered a few encouraging words, reminding her to stay strong. The jury was already in place, their eyes fixed on the proceedings. She could feel their curiosity, their need to understand, to know the story she had kept hidden for so long. The man, her abuser, sat on the other side of the room, looking as confident and composed as ever. His sharp suit, his perfectly styled hair, and the way he sat with such arrogance made him seem untouchable. He smiled occasionally as if he had already won the case. It made her sick. She knew that smile. She had seen it countless times over the years, and it always meant the same thing: he was in control. As the trial began, the opposing lawyer stood and presented his case, trying to paint her as a woman who was unstable, unreliable, and motivated by jealousy or revenge. Every word they spoke was designed to make her look small, to discredit her and her claims. She could feel herself shrinking under the weight of their attacks. They twisted the truth, made her feel as though everything she had endured was somehow her fault. But she had prepared for this. She had known it wouldn't be easy. The man she had been married to had always been a master manipulator. He could twist words, bend the truth, and convince people that he was the good guy. But now the truth was on her side. She wouldn't let him win again. It was her turn to speak. She had known this moment was coming. But as she stood up and made her way to the witness stand, her legs felt like they were made of stone. The courtroom was silent, all eyes on her. She could feel the heat of their gaze, the pressure of their expectations. But in that moment, all she could think about was what she had to say. She had to tell them the truth. The chair in front of her was cold, and she could feel the sweat on her palms as she gripped the edges. Her lawyer gave her a reassuring nod before sitting down. She glanced across the room at the man. He didn't even look at her, his attention fixed on the lawyer who was speaking on his behalf. He was pretending to be unaffected, pretending that everything was going according to his plan. But she knew the truth. She could see the tension in his jaw, the slight twitch in his eye. He was nervous. For the first time, he was nervous. The first question came, and she answered in a quiet, steady voice. She talked about the years of emotional abuse, the constant belittling, the way he made her feel small and insignificant. She spoke about the countless nights when he would scream at her for no reason, the days when she would cry herself to sleep, wondering what she had done wrong. She told them about the manipulation, how he twisted everything around until she began to question her own reality. She told them about the isolation, how he had driven away her friends, making her believe that no one else cared about her. Her voice was steady at first, but as she continued to speak, it began to crack. The memories flooded back, the hurt, the fear. She could feel the weight of it all pressing down on her again, threatening to break her, but she kept going. She had to. Her words felt like they were being torn from her soul, each one a small victory. She was speaking her truth, and no matter how difficult it was, she wouldn't stop. She had kept silent for too long. But not anymore. The room was silent as she spoke. Even the jury seemed to be holding their breath. She could see their faces, the way they were reacting to her words. She wasn't sure if it was sympathy or disbelief, but she could see that they were listening. They were hearing her, and that meant everything. When she finished, she sat back down, exhausted but relieved. She had done it. She had told the truth. She had stood up to him in a way she never thought possible. But the battle was far from over. The man's lawyer wasted no time in trying to discredit her, asking her questions designed to confuse and trip her up. He painted her as a liar, as someone who was simply making up stories to ruin the man's reputation. He questioned her memory, her character, even her motives. But she didn't flinch. She answered each question with the same steady calm, knowing that the truth was on her side. Her lawyer stood up to object several times, pointing out the attacks being made against her character. The judge called for a brief recess to allow the lawyers to speak privately, and she sat quietly in her chair, her hands clenched in her lap. She could feel the anger rising in her chest, the desire to shout at the injustice of it all, but she held it in. She had to stay focused. This was just one part of the process. She couldn't let him break her now. During the recess, she took a deep breath and tried to calm her nerves. She could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her, but she reminded herself that she had already done something incredible. She had stood up for herself. She had spoken out. That was a victory, no matter how small it seemed in the face of everything else. When the trial resumed, the opposing lawyer continued his attack, but she could see that the tide was starting to turn. The jury seemed less convinced by his arguments, less swayed by his charm. They were starting to see the truth. And that, more than anything, gave her the strength to keep going. She had already come so far. She had already proven that she was stronger than she had ever believed, and now it was just a matter of time before the truth came to light. She wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't going to let him control her, not now, not ever again. As the day drew to a close, she walked out of the courtroom with her head held high. The trial was far from over, but she knew she had already won. She had reclaimed her voice, and that was something no one, not even him, could ever take away. The days following her testimony felt like a blur, The moment stretched out in slow motion as she tried to piece together everything that had happened. The trial wasn't over, but she felt a shift inside herself. For so long, she had been caged in silence, weighed down by fear, but now there was a sense of freedom in her. It wasn't a freedom that came from winning, no. That would come later. But it was the freedom of speaking the truth, of standing up for herself, of not letting him control her anymore. She couldn't stop thinking about the faces in the courtroom, the jury, the lawyers, and the judge. Their expressions had changed as she spoke. They had been skeptical at first, maybe even dismissive. But when she had shared her story, it was like the atmosphere in the room had shifted. She could see that they were listening, that they were no longer just waiting for her to finish, but were actually hearing her. That moment, that connection with the people in the room was something she would never forget. But there was still so much to face. The man she had once called her partner hadn't even flinched during her testimony. He sat there as smug as ever, pretending that everything was fine. His silence spoke volumes, though. It was the silence of someone who knew that they were losing, someone who knew that the truth was finally catching up to them. That thought kept her going, giving her the strength to keep fighting. In the days that followed, her life was still a whirlwind of preparation for the next round of the trial. Her lawyer worked tirelessly, gathering more evidence, talking to more people who could confirm her story. The man's defense team continued their tactics, trying to twist every word, trying to make her out to be the villain. But with every passing day, she grew stronger. The support from her friends and the legal team was like a lifeline, pulling her through the darkest moments when the doubts crept in. There were still moments of fear, moments when she wondered if it would all be worth it, but those moments were becoming fewer. The more she faced him, the more she saw through his mask of charm. She began to understand just how much he had manipulated everyone around him, including herself. The truth had a way of opening her eyes to things she had never seen before, to patterns in his behavior that she had once excused, or simply didn't recognize. It wasn't just the people in the courtroom she had to face. It was the people outside of it, too. There were friends, family members, and acquaintances who had no idea what was really going on. They had always seen her as the strong, capable woman, the one who had it all together. But now, with everything coming to light, she was afraid of how they would see her. Would they still respect her? Would they still see her as the person she had been before all of this? Or would they see her as weak, as a victim? She tried to block out those thoughts. She couldn't worry about how others viewed her anymore. This wasn't about them. This was about her truth, and her journey to reclaiming herself. She couldn't change the past, and she couldn't control how others saw her, but she could control how she moved forward. And that's what she was determined to do. As the days turned into weeks, the trial continued to unfold. The man's side kept trying to twist the narrative, to paint her as someone who was bitter or lying. They dug into her past, searching for anything they could use to discredit her. But with every attempt, she stood firm. Her lawyer was always there, making sure the truth was never lost amidst the noise of their accusations. The more she listened to the lies being told about her, the more she realized how important it was to speak up, how important it was for her to take control of her own story. The man had tried for so long to make her feel small, to make her feel like she didn't matter, but now she was showing the world just how wrong he had been. And it felt empowering, even in the midst of everything else. One afternoon, as the trial dragged on, the man's lawyer stood up and started questioning the details of her testimony. He brought up moments she had shared, trying to twist them into something they weren't. He asked her questions designed to make her doubt herself, to make her second-guess her memories. The words cut deeper than she expected, and for a moment she felt herself faltering, but she didn't let it show. She took a deep breath and steadied herself. She remembered the strength she had found in herself over the past few weeks, and she refused to let him break her. Her lawyer stood up, objecting to the line of questioning, and the judge agreed, cutting the cross-examination short. She was grateful for the support, but more than that, she was proud of herself for not allowing those questions to shake her. Later that evening, she found herself alone in her apartment, reflecting on the day. The trial had left her emotionally drained, and she was starting to feel the weight of the fight. She had come so far, but she couldn't help but wonder how much longer it would take before the trial ended. How much longer would she have to face him, to relive everything that had happened? But she also knew that the end was in sight. She could feel it. She was close to the finish line. The next day, she returned to the courtroom with a renewed sense of purpose. She was done letting him control her emotions, her thoughts. She had found her voice, and now she was going to use it. The final part of the trial began, and this time the stakes felt even higher. The truth was almost in reach, but so much still hung in the balance. As the final arguments were made, she could feel the eyes of the jury on her. She could feel the weight of their expectations, but this time it didn't feel as heavy. This time she was ready to face whatever came next. Her lawyer spoke with power and conviction, laying out the case for why the man had to be held accountable. She could hear the passion in her lawyer's voice, and it reminded her of how far she had come. When the closing arguments were over, the courtroom went silent. The jury was asked to deliberate, and as they filed out, she could feel the tension hanging in the air. She didn't know how long they would be, but she knew it could take hours, maybe even days, before they came to a decision. As she sat there waiting, the realization hit her. No matter what happened, she had already won. She had spoken her truth. She had stood up for herself in a way she never thought possible. And that in itself was a victory. The man might have thought he was invincible, but he was wrong. The courtroom was no longer a place where he could hide behind his charm and power. Now it was a place where the truth had come to light and no one could ignore it. And soon, no matter what the verdict was, she would walk away from this trial a stronger person than she had ever been before. The days after the jury left the courtroom felt like an eternity. Each hour seemed to stretch on forever, filled with uncertainty and anticipation. She found herself unable to focus on anything else, the weight of the decision hanging over her like a dark cloud. All she could do was wait and hope. The trial had taken everything from her. It had drained her emotionally, physically, and mentally. But it had also given her something she hadn't had in years, a sense of purpose. She had found her voice, the courage to stand up and speak her truth. No matter what the outcome of the trial was, she knew she had done everything she could to make sure her story was heard. And that alone was a victory. Her lawyer kept in touch, offering words of reassurance, reminding her that the process could take time. The jury had to deliberate, go over the evidence, and make their decision. She tried to be patient, tried to focus on her life outside of the courtroom, but it was difficult. Every moment felt like it could be the moment when the verdict came in. It was late in the afternoon when the call came. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw her lawyer's name on the screen. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she answered. "Hello? Are you sitting down?" Her lawyer's voice asked gently. Her heart pounded in her chest. "What's happening?" she asked, barely able to keep the fear from her voice. "Sit down," her lawyer repeated. "The jury has reached a verdict." The words sent a chill through her, a mix of fear and anticipation washing over her. She nodded, even though she knew her lawyer couldn't see her. She sat down on the edge of her bed, the room suddenly feeling too small. "The verdict is in," her lawyer continued, her voice steady, but filled with emotion. "He's been found guilty." For a moment she didn't speak. She couldn't. The words didn't make sense. After everything she had been through, after all the pain, all the fear, she had expected anything but this. Her mind raced, trying to process what she had just heard. Her lawyer didn't rush her. "You did it. You spoke the truth and they heard you. It's over. He's been held accountable." It felt surreal, like a dream she couldn't quite believe. She had won. Not just the trial, but her freedom. The man who had controlled her life for so long, who had made her feel like she was nothing, was now facing the consequences of his actions. He was no longer untouchable. A wave of relief washed over her, and then, just as quickly, it was replaced with a quiet sense of peace. She hadn't known how much weight she was carrying until it was finally lifted. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe again. Her lawyer offered to meet with her in person to go over the details of the verdict, but she wasn't sure if she was ready for that yet. She needed a moment to let the news settle in, to take it all in. She hung up the phone and sat there, still in disbelief, as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The relief was palpable, but so was the exhaustion. She had spent so long fighting, so long trying to prove her worth, that it felt almost impossible to imagine a life beyond the trial. She had spent years living in fear, living under the shadow of someone else's control. But now, for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could finally take her life back. That evening, she took a long walk through the quiet streets of her neighborhood. It was a simple act, but it felt like an act of liberation. She could walk wherever she wanted. whenever she wanted, without looking over her shoulder, without feeling like someone was controlling her every step. The world was wide open to her now, full of possibilities she had never allowed herself to consider before. As she walked, she thought about everything she had been through, the years of silence, the fear, the moments when she had questioned herself. She thought about the strength she had discovered in herself, the courage it had taken to speak up and stand in front of everyone and tell her story. And she thought about the future, about what might come next. She didn't have all the answers. The road ahead would still have its challenges. She still had to rebuild her life, find new ways to trust herself and others. But she was no longer the woman who had walked into that courtroom, terrified and broken. She was stronger now. She was free. Her thoughts were interrupted when she saw a familiar face ahead of her. It was a friend she hadn't seen in years, someone who had tried to reach out to her in the past but whom she had pushed away. She had kept her distance from everyone, too ashamed of the life she had been living, too afraid that they would see her as weak. But now, with everything that had happened, she felt ready to reconnect. She smiled at her friend who smiled back, the warmth in their eyes telling her everything she needed to know. They embraced, and in that moment she knew she wasn't alone anymore. That night, she found herself sitting in her apartment, surrounded by the people who had supported her, her lawyer, her friend, and others who had been there for her every step of the way. They celebrated the victory together, but more than that, they celebrated her strength, her resilience, and the new chapter of her life that was just beginning. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but she had taken the first step. She had stood up for herself and she had won. And now she could start the process of healing, of rebuilding a life that was truly her own. She was no longer defined by the man who had tried to control her, no longer defined by the pain he had caused her. She was free to be herself, free to live her life the way she wanted to. As the night went on, she couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for everything she had learned. She had learned that no matter how small you feel, no matter how powerless you might think you are, there is always strength inside you. Sometimes it takes hitting rock bottom to find it, but when you do, it's more powerful than anything you could ever imagine. She looked around at the people who had supported her and smiled. She knew that this was just the beginning. There would be tough days ahead, moments when the fear and doubt crept back in, but she also knew that she had the strength to face them. She had already overcome the hardest part. She had faced the truth and the world had hurt her. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she was excited to find out, because the future was hers. The life she had fought for, the life she had reclaimed was just beginning, and nothing could take that away from her. As the weeks passed after the trial, she found herself in a new world, a world that, for the first time in years, felt hers to navigate. The court case was over. The weight of the past had lifted, and now she was faced with the daunting task of rebuilding her life. But as much as she tried to focus on the future, she couldn't ignore the emotional scars that remained. Her days were filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow, excitement and fear. The victory in court had been a triumph, but the process of healing was far from complete. She had won justice, but there was still so much she had to work through. Every day felt like a step forward, but there were days when the past seemed to creep back in, threatening to pull her back into the darkness. She spent a lot of time alone, in the quiet of her apartment, reflecting on everything that had happened. The silence gave her space to think, but it also made her realize how much she had lost along the way. There were days when the loneliness was overwhelming, when she couldn't help but wonder if she would ever truly feel whole again. She had never been the kind of person who liked to ask for help. For so long, she had convinced herself that she had to handle everything on her own. But now, with everything that had happened, she knew that she couldn't do it alone. She needed to lean on the people who cared about her, the ones who had stood by her during the hardest moments of her life. It was hard at first. It felt vulnerable, opening up to people after so many years of keeping everything bottled up inside. But slowly, she began to let others in. She called her closest friends, the ones she had pushed away during the darkest times, and apologized for her absence. They were understanding more than she had expected, and slowly they began to rebuild their relationships. One evening, after a long day of work, she met up with an old friend at a cafe. They sat in the corner, sipping their drinks, and talked about everything. For the first time in a long time, she felt like herself again. She wasn't the broken woman who had been cowering in the corner of her own life. She was just her, someone who could laugh, someone who could enjoy the simple moments again. But even as she moved forward, she couldn't forget what had happened. The man, the one who had controlled her life for so long, was still out there. His presence loomed over her, not physically but mentally. She had won the trial, but the emotional scars he had left behind were still fresh. There were nights when she would lie awake, wondering if he would ever really leave her alone. The fear still lingered deep in her bones. One afternoon, she decided to take a step she had been putting off for weeks. She contacted a therapist. It felt like a big decision, but she knew it was one she had to make. Talking to someone who wasn't connected to her past, would help her untangle the mess of emotions she had been carrying around. Her first session was awkward. She had no idea where to start, what to say, or how to explain what she had been through. But as the therapist listened, gently guiding her through her thoughts, something inside her began to shift. She realized that she had never really talked about what had happened, not in the way she needed to. She had kept everything inside for so long, telling herself that she was fine, that she could handle it. But now, for the first time, she allowed herself to feel everything she had been hiding. The tears came, unbidden and unexpected, as she finally allowed herself to release the hurt, the anger and the sadness. It felt like a flood, everything pouring out at once, but in that moment she didn't feel weak. She felt strong, because she was finally letting go of the things that had been weighing her down for so long. Over time, her sessions became a lifeline. She learned to understand the patterns of abuse she had been subjected to, how they had affected her sense of self, her relationships, and her choices. Slowly, she began to heal. But healing wasn't a straight line. There were days when she felt like she was making progress, and other days when the weight of everything felt too heavy to bear. But she kept going one step at a time. With each passing week, she felt more like herself. She began to rediscover the things that had once brought her joy: reading, cooking, walking in the park, spending time with friends. It wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about learning to live alongside it, to build a new life without letting the past define her. And then one day she found herself in the midst of something unexpected: a new relationship. It had started slowly, with cautious steps, but she had found someone who understood her, someone who saw her for who she truly was, not for the version of herself she had been forced to become. She was terrified at first, terrified that she would repeat the same mistakes, terrified that she wasn't ready to trust again. But as the relationship grew, she realized something important. She was ready. She had learned to trust herself, to set boundaries, to recognize her worth. The new relationship wasn't without its challenges. It required patience, understanding, and a willingness to be vulnerable. But it was also filled with kindness, respect, and the kind of love she had always dreamed of. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time, she felt like she was in a relationship where she didn't have to hide parts of herself, where she didn't have to be afraid. As the months passed, she continued to grow. The scars from the past were still there, but they no longer controlled her. She had taken back her life piece by piece, and while the journey was far from over, she knew she had come a long way. The woman who had walked into that courtroom, trembling and uncertain, was no longer the woman who sat in the quiet of her apartment, smiling at the future. She had become someone new, stronger, wiser, more resilient, and most importantly, she had learned to trust herself again. There would still be moments when the past crept in, when she remembered the fear, the pain, the manipulation. But she had learned that those moments didn't define her. They were part of her story, but they weren't the whole story. She was more than the woman who had been controlled, more than the woman who had fought for her freedom. She was the woman who had rebuilt herself from the ground up, the woman who was finally free, and that freedom, true, unshakable freedom, was hers to keep. Months had passed since the trial ended, and while the verdict had brought her some peace, it wasn't a magic fix. The road to recovery had been slow, with many moments of doubt and moments of triumph. She had learned that healing wasn't a destination. It was a journey, one that could feel both empowering and overwhelming at the same time. Her life was starting to feel more like her own again, but there were still days when the weight of the past felt like it was pulling her down. She had spent so long trying to convince herself that everything was fine, that she could handle it all on her own. But now she realized how important it was to lean on others, to not carry everything alone. One evening, as she sat by the window of her apartment, watching the sunset, she realized how much had changed. The silence of her space no longer felt suffocating. It felt like a quiet that allowed her to breathe. Her apartment, once filled with shadows of the past, now felt like a fresh start. She had chosen each piece of furniture, each plant, and every book on the shelf, and each one felt like a reminder of her own strength. But still, there were moments when she felt vulnerable. There were days when she had to remind herself that she wasn't weak for needing help. She had spent so many years believing that asking for help was a sign of failure, but now, she understood that true strength came from knowing when to reach out, to trust in others. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from her friend. They were meeting up the next day for coffee. She smiled as she read the message. She'd been making an effort to stay connected with the people who had supported her during the darkest times. Her friends had always been there for her, but she hadn't always been there for them. It felt good to make amends, to rebuild those connections. The next morning, she met her friend at the coffee shop. They sat in the corner, the sunlight filtering through the windows, casting a warm glow on the room. It was a simple moment, but it felt significant. She felt herself relax, her shoulders dropping as she settled into the conversation. They talked about everything: life, work, and the future. They laughed about old memories and shared stories about their new beginnings. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to just enjoy the moment without worrying about what might happen next. She didn't need to have all the answers. She just needed to be present. And for the first time, it felt easy. As they finished their coffee, her friend looked at her with a knowing smile. "You've changed," her friend said softly. "In a good way. I can see it in you. You're not the same person you were before." She felt a lump form in her throat. She had been afraid that people would see her as weak or damaged, but her friend's words were a reminder of how far she had come. She hadn't just survived the past. She had grown from it. She was no longer the woman who had been controlled, who had kept quiet, who had believed she wasn't enough. She was someone new, someone strong, someone capable, someone who deserved to be happy. Over the next few weeks, she continued to focus on her healing. Therapy had been a big part of that process, but so had the smaller moments: taking walks in the park, spending time with friends, and doing things she loved without feeling guilty or fearful. The small steps had begun to add up, and before she knew it, she started to feel a sense of peace settle within her. But there was still work to be done. She knew that her journey wasn't over. There were still moments when the past crept in, when memories would surface unexpectedly and she would find herself back in the darkness for a moment. But she was learning how to handle those moments. She was learning that healing wasn't about forgetting or erasing the past. It was about learning how to live with it, how to move forward without letting it control her. One day, she decided to take a trip. She had always wanted to visit the coast, to see the ocean and feel the wind on her face. It had always been a dream she'd pushed aside, thinking there was no time for such things. But now she felt like she had nothing holding her back. She booked a small cabin by the water and spent a weekend there, away from everything and everyone. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was soothing, and the fresh sea air felt like a balm for her soul. She spent the weekend reading, walking along the beach, and simply being in the moment. She didn't have to be anyone or do anything. She was just herself. As she sat on the porch of the cabin, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what freedom felt like. Not just freedom from the man who had tried to control her, but freedom from the fear that had once held her captive. She was free to be who she was, free to create the life she wanted. The trip was a reminder of just how much she had reclaimed. It wasn't about grand gestures or big victories. It was about the little moments that made life worth living. It was about knowing that she was enough, just as she was. When she returned home, things continued to fall into place. Her job had become more fulfilling, and she was starting to consider new possibilities for her future. The idea of starting a new career, maybe even going back to school, no longer felt impossible. The world was wide open to her, and she was finally ready to embrace it. But even with all the positive changes, there were still moments when doubts would creep in. She still had to work on trusting people, on allowing herself to fully open up to others. The scars from the past were still there, but they no longer defined her. She had learned that it was okay to be imperfect, to not have everything figured out. One evening, as she sat in her living room, scrolling through old photos, she paused on one particular picture. It was a photo from a time before everything had gone wrong, a time when life felt simpler. It was a picture of her smiling, carefree, surrounded by friends. As she looked at the photo, she realized something important. She had found that part of herself again. She had found the person who could laugh, who could live in the moment, who could love life. It wasn't that she was the same person she had been before everything had happened. She was different now. She had been through so much, and that had changed her. But in many ways, she was the same. The core of who she was, the woman who could dream, who could hope, who could love, hadn't disappeared. She had just rediscovered it piece by piece, and as she sat there looking at that photo, she made a promise to herself. She promised that she would continue to move forward, that she would not let the past define her, that she would keep rebuilding, keep growing, because she was stronger now. She had learned how to stand up for herself, how to trust her instincts, how to love herself, and that was a foundation she could build a new life on. The journey was far from over. There would still be challenges, still be moments of fear and doubt, but she had learned that no matter what came next, she could face it. She had already overcome so much, and now she was ready to face whatever came her way, with confidence, with courage, and with the knowledge that she was worthy of everything good that life had to offer.